So up to this point, plants have just started evolving from algae. And so if you recall, in our last section, we talked about how algae are able to undergo photosynthesis because they have chlorophyll, and plants are believed to evolve from algae. So one of the first evolutionary event that we observe with regards to plants as they evolve is this movement from bodies of water to this movement of land. So at this point, we are going to be looking at bryophytes, which are slowly moving on to land, but they still rely heavily on water. Specifically, they rely heavily on water in order to reproduce, because their gametes actually need moisture in order to form sporophyte. And so here are some examples of these bryophytes. So they include the hornwort, they include liverwort, and they include moss. And so as you're walking through the redwood tree forest here that we have in California, you've probably seen these different type of plants because they tend to live in more moist terrain because they rely on that moist environment to complete their life cycle, right, which is to complete reproduction. And so non-vascular plants are gametophyte dominant, which means that the majority of their life, they will be found in the gametophyte state. So in this state right here, these are the gametophytes right here, and then this is just a gametophyte. So they're gametophyte dominant. They will spend most of the time in this state, but when they are ready to reproduce, then they will form these sporophytes. And these sporophytes are actually dependent on the gametophyte, so they're actually part of the gametophyte bodies because they rely on the gametophyte for nutrients. Look at the plant cycle a little bit more, but I just thought I'd bring up a little historical tidbit for you guys. So right here, what I have is moss. This moss is not living. I bought it at the plant store. But I just wanted to bring up that in World War I, when soldiers were having a difficult time finding bandages, a lot of medics would actually use the moss as bandages because they actually have some antiseptic properties to them. So it's kind of interesting to know, right, that we're able to actually, that humans were able to find a useful purpose for moss during a time and able to actually use them as bandage. And like, who knew that they had antiseptic properties? I'm not sure how they figured that out. All right, let's look at the plant's life cycle. Okay, so here we have an example of a moss right here. And as I mentioned, in its mature state, most of the time they will, non-vascular plants will be found in the gametophyte state. But when they're ready to reproduce, they will actually form the sporophytes. So these sporophytes appear for like a short period of time, mainly to produce spores. And as I mentioned, they are dependent on the gametophyte in order to obtain food, and they're actually attached to the gametophyte themselves. So the sporophyte will actually produce spores, and so they will undergo meiosis to make these different little spores. And these spores will mature into gametophyte, but it can mature into either male or female gametophytes. These gametophytes are independent plant body that basically produce sex organ or gametes, right? They can either produce sperm or they can produce eggs. And so where I mentioned to you that non-vascular plants do not have a vascular system, but they still depend a lot on water. And why is it that they depend on water? Well, they need that moisture to help them actually travel in order to find one another. So we can see here an example of it which drops of rain is able to help disperse the sperms. And so the rain droplets we can see here is capturing the sperms and carrying it over to the female with reproductive organs, right? So it's carrying the male reproductive organs into the female reproductive organ, and the sperms can swim down until it finds the egg. Once it finds the egg, they can undergo fertilization, right? So they can undergo fertilization to form a 2N. So I want you guys to keep in mind that at this point the sperm and the eggs are haploid, so they're 1N. So they undergo fertilization, they can form this 2N right here, which we can also think of as a zygote right here. And that zygote can undergo mitosis in order to develop into a mature sporophyte and gameophyte. Well, they will actually mature into a gameophyte, and then when they're ready to reproduce again, then this sporophyte, which is attached to the gameophyte, will appear and develop, and then we'll start the cycle again, where the sporophyte will undergo meiosis in order to form the spores, and yada yada yada. So, as I mentioned before, in non-vascular plants, the dominant stage is this haploid stage, which is gameophyte. This is where we will most of the time find these plant organisms. And when they need to reproduce, then the sporophyte will develop out, attached to the gameophyte, will develop, form spores so that it can undergo fertilization. And one of the things I want to mention to you is recall that actually to have successful reproductive stage, that these plants rely on water. Okay, let's move on to the next evolutionary event cycle, where we start forming vascular tissues. So at this point, we still do not have seeds yet, but the plants we're starting to see plants develop a vascular tissue. That is, they're starting to develop a root system in order to uptake water to do photosynthesis. And so we're seeing an increase in photosynthesis as these plants are able to pull water more. So we're moving on to our first state, right? So we're moving more towards the land. We haven't formed seed yet, so these are seedless vascular plants. Example of this would be the lycophyte and ferns. And so these plants exist in a dominant sporophyte state. And so what happens is the fertilized egg will develop into an embryo, and that embryo will grow into the sporophyte. The sporophyte will actually grow from the gameophyte, right? So it's actually growing from this fertilized egg. But as it grows, the gameophyte will actually disintegrate. And so most of the lifespan of seedless vascular plant is in the sporophyte. And the sporophyte will undergo meiosis to be able to produce spores. Okay, so because they do not have seeds yet, the sporophyte are still dependent on water in order to reproduce. So before we look at the life cycle, let's just look at this illustration here and note a few things. So one of the things that I want to note is that we're now forming vascular tissue. So we can see that here with the roots, right? So we're starting to form vascular tissue that allows us to more easily do photosynthesis. Along with that, we're starting to form some leaves that are, again, facilitating this greater photosynthesis that we start seeing. So before seedless vascular plant, we were still able to photosynthesize, but that wasn't as dominant as here. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that the state, these seedless vascular plant, the state that they're mainly in is sporophyte. So they're dominant sporophyte. And so in the next picture, we'll actually show how these sporophytes can develop the spores that are needed for it to survive. So let's look at the next one, which is actually looking at fern as our example of the plant cycle. So the next time you walk through a redwood tree forest, or even if you go to the plant store and you see these ferns, take a look at the ferns and lift them up on the underside. And you might notice that the underside has a lot of these spores, right? So you might notice that there's a lot of these brown little dots. You can also observe them in our lab. Like if you remember in the plant lab, there were some ferns, and if you flip them over, you might have seen that on the lower surface of the frond leaves, that there actually are spores. And so in nature, you can imagine that if the wind picks up the leaf and kind of blows it, that these spores can actually be released and released into the environment, right, to kind of help spread them. However, they still need water for reproduction. So up to this point, for both non-vascular plant and the seedless vascular plant, these plants still rely on water for reproduction. So let's take a look at this, and let's start off with the sporophyte. So just imagine that the sporophyte has these spores, and the spores are developed through meiosis, right? And the spores get released into the environment. So once the spores are released into the environment, they can actually grow into gameophytes here. And the gameophytes can mature into a mature gameophyte. And what we might notice here is that these gameophytes produce both eggs as well as sperm. So this mature gameophyte can have both eggs or sperm. However, the eggs and the sperm have to be able to find each other. So if you've noticed, ferns tend to grow and thrive in more damp environment, more wet environment, because they still rely on water for the sperm and the egg to find one another. Once the sperm and egg find one another, so the sperm will still travel, these gametes will still travel through water to be able to find the egg. And once they fertilize, so right now we have 2 haploid, right? They can actually undergo fertilization to form a diploid. So the zygote can form, and the zygote will develop into a mature plant. But notice that the sporophyte, because remember we said that seedless vascular plant are sporophyte dominant, that the sporophyte will actually grow from the attached gameophyte. But once they mature, this gameophyte will die off, and this mature plant spends most of its life as a sporophyte that can produce spores. We've talked about non-vascular plants, and we talked about seedless vascular plants. And so let's retrace and see what the main movement is. When we went from non-vascular plant, we're moving from water to land, and then we still don't have a vascular root system yet. So in seedless vascular plant, we've evolved to start forming a vascular system. So being able to start forming leaves and roots so that we can undergo photosynthesis more efficiently in order to adapt and thrive on land. Both non-vascular and seedless vascular plant at this point still depend on water in order to have successful reproductive state. Okay, let's move on to seeds. So we're moving on to more of what we recognize day to day as our modern plants. I'll see you guys in the next lecture when we talk about seeds.